That's a good thing. Let's begin with prayer. Lord Jesus, many times as we enter into the realm of suffering, we feel lonely and isolated. And Lord Jesus, you experienced that yourself when you cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And yet we've also experienced, as we have come together, as we have listened to one another, that we are not alone, that we all have suffering in some shape or form. And as we hear each other and as we support each other, we find out that we have strength that allows us to go on. So thank you, Lord, for the love that you have given us. And that love that you've given us enables us to love one another. So may we continue to love one another. I thank you, Lord, for these weeks that we have been together and for all the wonderful insights that have come forth from those who have been a part of this group. So as we leave this group, may we continue to be open to each other. May we continue to support one another. May we continue to find new opportunities to minister to those who are suffering. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, happy Reformation, everybody. Thinking about Luther today, one of his favorite psalms was Psalm 46. And you may recall that out of that came "A mighty fortress is our God," and many other things. But that was one of his special psalms. God is a very present help in time of trouble. And I think that really has been true of our weeks together here too. That we have found that in the midst of our trouble, in the midst of all of the ups and downs that we have been through, God has been a very present help in time of trouble. So hang on to that image, because it's a wonderful image. The earth can be removed, the mountains can be cast into the midst of the sea, but God is our refuge and our strength. So before we go on today, I wanted to mention a little bit that I've been talking with a member who's been dealing with cancer for some time, and one of the things that came up in our conversation was the desire to have a support group here at St. John's, not only for cancer patients, but perhaps for anybody who is bearing some kind of a burden, someone who is just kind of struggling to get through. So a support group would enable us to come together. It'd be a little different than this setting. We would probably be in a circle, and we would go around, and everybody would be able to introduce themselves, and they'd be able to talk about what was on their heart at that particular time. And the group would be there to listen, not to really give answers, but perhaps to help that person to clarify things, to maybe change their mind on some things. So that's kind of how support groups work. So I talked with Pastor Schrader, and he was saying that perhaps after the holidays would be the best time to start. So I'm looking at the month of January, and we're looking at a Thursday evening. And so one of the questions that I have, are there any people in this group that might be interested in being a part of that support group? Just like a little show of hands here. So if you're interested, would you raise your hand? Okay. All right. So we will be publicizing this in the bulletin, news and notes. So kind of look for future announcements about that. And before I forget, last chance here, for those who are watching online today, if you want to text in a question, and the boys are primed here. So the number is 262-374-5957. And that's kind of one of my goals. I want to go out with at least one question online. Yeah.
I just wanted to mention that one of our churches in Canada just started a grief support group along the lines of what you're describing.
Yeah.
So they're hoping to serve their members and community that way.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm glad to hear that others are doing that too. Because I think it's a wonderful way to do ministry. And it not only can be good for our congregation, but it could also be of interest to other people. So perhaps you as a member have a friend or a neighbor who is going through some really tough things. And again, they would just kind of welcome having somebody that would listen to them. So I think the group is going to be designed along those kind of lines too. One of the interesting things to me at Freighter is the fairly significant number of people who are not interested in pastoral care. And so when I come around and introduce myself as a chaplain, sometimes the response is, well, I got nothing else to do. You know, they're trying to fill time, so hey, come on in and fill my time. Sometimes people will say it doesn't do any good to talk, but you know, let's give it a shot anyway. So I think there is a significant number of people out there who aren't particularly looking for spiritual care. But when it is offered to them, they were kind of like, whoa, okay, I didn't know that there was something like that out there. So kind of keep that in mind for yourself, that as you are talking with people, they may not be particularly interested in you as a religious person, but they sure like to talk to you because of your kindness and because of your listening ability. So just kind of go with that and use that. And that's one of the things I like about God, is that he is very quiet, very behind the scenes, but he makes himself known. So any other questions or comments that anybody has as you think back over all the things that we've talked about in these previous weeks? Mm-hmm.
Would there be any way for the support group to start before the holidays? Because speaking for myself, I know the holidays would be a really hard time for
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would be open to that. So maybe I can discuss that with Pastor Schrader, and yeah. Ooh. Hold on, folks.
Okay. Someone said, what's the worst reaction you've ever gotten as a chaplain, and how'd you deal with that?
Okay. What's the worst reaction? I guess the worst reaction I got, a pastor called me, and his uncle was a patient at the Veterans Hospital, and he had terminal cancer. And he was unchurched, and so this pastor thought, okay, maybe we can still reach this guy. And so he asked if I would go and visit him. So I went to Veterans Hospital, and I came in and introduced myself, and his comment was, "Who the hell sent you?" So I guess that was probably my worst experience. And so I wasn't going to lie to him. And I said, your nephew, Tom, had called and asked if I would stop. Oh, yeah, sure, I kind of figured that. But then he got to talking, and we had quite an extensive visit. And so I said at the end of the visit, let me be clear now. You didn't want a pastoral visit, but you don't mind company. Yeah, I don't mind company. And so that became one of those things where I continued to go back and see him. And I think that, eventually what was going on, he did come to terms with his estrangement from God. And that turned out okay. So it's just one of those things that you never know. And, don't be intimidated. I guess my first reaction was to turn around and leave because it wasn't exactly welcoming. But hang in there. Don't let people, with their brusqueness, sometimes perhaps again the way that they were brought up, some of the roughest and toughest people that I have met inside are not that way. So it's more of a wall and a defense to prevent people from getting close to them. And that raises an intriguing question. Why don't they want people to get close to them?
They might touch on their emotions and how they really feel about what's happening to them.
Okay, it might touch on their emotions. And boy, their emotions is one of the scariest things to them. Because they are afraid that if they touch those emotions, they're going to fall apart. And, then what? Sometimes people say, I'm afraid to start crying because I don't know if I'll be able to stop. So I think that is an issue there, that they are kind of afraid of the power of those emotions that are inside. Any other thoughts on that?
Well, I grew up in a household where my father was, don't tell anyone. Mm-hmm. Because either A, they don't really care. They're just giving you, lip service. They just want, to be nosy. Yeah. So you didn't express yourself, to other people. You just didn't. And I remember people would ask my mother, well, how are you doing? And my mother would go, well, yeah. She had a way around it. Yeah. And you would just tell by her, well, oh, is something going on? Oh, you know. And they did. Because, but I think that's, that stuck with me. And for many years, you don't go there because, they say they're interested. They say they're going to listen. But, in reality, it's just, they're just being polite. That was the attitude. Yeah.
And I do think that is true, that people express an interest but aren't really interested. And in Marquezan, too, a small town, I went down and got the mail every day, and the postmaster always said, hey, how's it going? And then I realized that he really didn't want to know. But it was just his standard phrase, and he said it to everybody, and some people responded, and most of them didn't. So, it is that kind of a thing. Do people really care? And I think the secretiveness, and I'm also thinking that oftentimes people who have that wall have been hurt. So somewhere in their childhood or in their life, as they were going along, they've been wounded. And if you've been wounded, you're very reluctant to let anybody see that or come close to that. Because, oh my goodness, if you get wounded again, that could almost kill you, couldn't it? So I've come to look for that type of thing, that behind that shield that many people have put up, there is a heart that is longing to be ministered to, but is so afraid that if you open that up, you could get hurt, can't you? I think every one of us here is very attuned to that vulnerability. For me, growing up on a farm, you had to be tough, you had to be strong. You had to, again, do things that were not easy to do. So again, you had to slaughter animals. You had to cut the chicken's head off if you wanted to have fried chicken for dinner. So that kind of toughens you, and it makes you, again, put on that armor. So, you know, my dad too, he had that armor on. And so, you know, you had to castrate pigs. Again, that was part of preparing them for market. The meat tasted better if you did that. That is not a pleasant thing. So he was the surgeon, and he needed an assistant, and that was me. And I did not want to participate in that situation, but my father didn't ask me if I wanted to. It was expected, so I did it. So all those things, I think, from the way that we are raised, and you were talking about secrecy. Again, my mother too, she hated it for people to know her business, the party line, you know, where your phone would ring and you'd pick it up and click, 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 click. You know, everybody down the line was listening in on the call. So she hated that. And so she was pretty good, like your mother, at saying, well, you know, and not really say anything. But gossip was rampant, and somehow people figured stuff out. And if they didn't, they made it up. And then that became what everybody thought was the truth. So isn't life interesting? Yes.
I think that fear of and vulnerability is also on the listener side. I would say for me, it's been bothering me all week that when Rachel so bravely told her story last week, that we were silent. And I think it's because we don't know what to say.
Yeah.
We don't want to say the wrong thing,
Yeah.
you know. So
Yeah.
it's on that side too.
And thank you for mentioning that, because the vulnerability on our part, we all feel that. We all think we should be doing something. We should be fixing. We should have a wonderful answer. You know, and the beautiful thing is that was the best thing we could do, was to be silent. I can't think of anything that honored Rachel more than our silence, than we just allowed her to speak of all of those things that make her life such a challenge. So inadvertently, accidentally, we did the right thing. And that's been a huge thing for me as a chaplain. Theologically trained, I know scriptures and passages and theological concepts. So I have lots of things I could say to people. But 90% of the time, the best thing I can do is shut up. Let that person talk. And it continues to amaze me how often, after the silence, when the person has stopped talking, that they'll just kind of sit there for a minute, and it's sort of, and they've been listening to what they've been saying, and then they'll come out with something. And it's really good. So I often think that what's inside people helps them more than what I've got to say. And I think, again, okay, just a second. Getting back to what we talked about before, sometimes you'll see a theme come out of that. And so then you can maybe comment on that. It sounds like this is an issue that you're really struggling with. And then that, they can kind of go off of that too then. Okay, back to you.
Have you ever encountered a case where you suspected that it wasn't necessarily a medical issue, but it might have been something demonic?
Something demonic, yeah. You remember The Exorcist, that movie, gosh, did that go back to like the 60s or something? Where, it talked about demon possession. And the Catholic Church does have a rite where certain priests then will come in and they will exorcise that demon. I see evil in so many ways. I guess not in terms of the movie where someone is kind of foaming at the mouth and they're just going nuts and they're doing all kinds of damage. My experience with Satan is much more subtle. And I think probably the biggest thing is the unawareness that people are taken over by the demonic thinking and don't know it and think that they are actually fine. So I find that really scary, because sometimes I do not know how to pierce that shield that is there. So I think the scariest evil that I see in our world is that, Paul talks about powers and principalities in high places. So I just think of the governments of the world. How many dictatorships we have throughout the world, in Africa and China and major countries all over the place. And again, many of the things that these dictatorships do are demonic, aren't they? So they have no concern for the common citizen. It's about money. And so they've got billions in Swiss banking accounts. They have taken the resources of their country and put it all into their own pockets. So that type of thing, you're kind of saying to yourself, okay, how do we get rid of that? And we've seen some of the wars that we've gotten into where we can topple those governments, and then what comes in its place? It's the same thing. It's a different face, but it's still the same thing. So that kind of thing is very frightening, isn't it? And I think for me, as one of God's people, I just feel overwhelmed sometimes. Well, what can one person do? And then you go back to Martin Luther. Did he feel that? He was up against the whole political church system, and he was one man. And all the powers of the church were unleashed against him. And then he wrote, "Though devils all the world should fill, all eager to devour us, we tremble not, we fear no ill, they shall not overcome us." I mean, wow. Okay. So there's a good hymn verse for you, isn't it? When you feel intimidated, when you feel small, but use what you have and do the ministry that is before you. And you don't know what's going to come out of that. But there is power, isn't there, in love. And we've seen that as we have met these last weeks. When I started the group, I came in with the thought, I see a lot of things in the patients that I visit in the hospital and the things that they talk about, but that's a one-on-one. And so I thought to myself, okay, now you're coming into a group and you don't know, is anybody going to have the courage to speak up? Is anybody going to want to share? And that was a total open question in my mind. And I want to give you an A as a group because you shared. And that really has made these weeks for me just a beautiful experience. So thank you so much for having the courage and for trusting your fellow believers here and being able to speak what was on your heart. That was truly an incredible thing. So any other questions that, yeah?
Pastor, you talked a lot about end-of-life situations. Can you discuss a little bit more about chemical dependency or addictions, or how maybe family members may react to that differently than reacting to like someone that has an end-of-life situation?
Yeah, good question. And I didn't know what kind of time we were going to have today, but I thought perhaps addiction would be an issue that would be of interest to many of you who are here. I think there are a number of things when we get into addictions. Many of you have heard the term enabling. So one of the things that happens when you have a family member who is addicted is, how do you handle that? And so sometimes you don't want to lose that person. You don't want that person to leave the family circle. And so even though you don't like what the person is doing, even though you know that many of the behaviors are extremely harmful, you still kind of go along with it. You may bankroll it. You may, again, support some of the habits of that person. And so again, that's where we get into those hard things. Should we be doing that? And is that helpful? And what are alternate things that we could do? So let's think about that for a few minutes of, again, what do you do when a person has a habit and it's costly and they maybe have lost their employment and they are going to be out on the street unless somebody pays the rent. So how should we approach all of those kind of things? Mm-hmm.
You could take a very firm approach and say that you'll pay their expenses, but you'll be watching to make sure they don't continue to abuse the substance, whatever it happens to be.
Okay. All right. So did you call it a measured approach?
I said a firm approach.
A firm approach. Okay. Yeah, and I think you hear the term tough love. And so, again, I think, there is merit in that, isn't there? So you are saying to the person, there are some boundaries here. And I think that often is an issue for people who are caught up in an addiction, is that there are no boundaries. So they're just, everything is okay. They can steal your jewelry off your dresser. They can forge your name on a check. They can take your car. I mean, they can do just unbelievable things. Because again, the power of that addiction is just so incredible that they just can close their mind to the damage that they are doing. So when you say to them, I will help you as much as I can, but these are the limits. Sometimes you will see where a street person is begging for money, and you know if you give them the money that it's going to go for a bottle. So if you say to that person, you want breakfast? I'll take you to a cafe. I'll pay for your breakfast. That would be an example, I guess, where you're showing a concern for their physical well-being and helping them with that, rather than continuing to give them the alcohol. So I think those kinds of things we are looking at when we're dealing with addictions, that we try as best as we can to put some parameters, some barriers around what they're doing. Now, I don't think that the success rate is very high on those things, is it? So I think one of the other issues is how much patience do you have? How much love do you have? And I think, again, we need to really be honest with ourselves. Sometimes we can get burned out. You know, you've borne with this person for years, perhaps, and you get to that point where you just can't do it anymore. So I want you to pay attention to that also. It's not only what that person is doing to you, but what is the effect on you. And when you can no longer muster the support and the love, then I think you have to name that. You have to let the other person know that's what's going on. I always look at the story of the prodigal son. And how often have you looked at that, where the son comes and says, "Give me the money," and the father says, "Here it is"? Doesn't that strike you as just being, what? Why are you doing that? That's crazy. So what do you suppose the father was thinking when he said, "Here it is, go"?
Possibly a test of the son's character?
A test of the son's character, okay? So, again, this is where the son is really going to find out who he is. So I think that is part of it. I think that is in there. The son is basically saying, "Yeah, I'm good, I'm ready." And the dad is saying, "No, you're not." But the only way the son is going to find out is if he goes. And then he will find out he wasn't ready. Sue?
I think I've been told that in that culture, to do that would be almost the height of insult. You could not insult your parents any more than saying, "I don't want to be part of this family. I don't want you to be my father. Give me my inheritance and I'm going." And so that, to me, that's like, well, the father says, "You want to go? Go." You know?
Yeah.
See what it gets you. In ways, it was tough love for him. You don't know the pre-story, but obviously the son wanted out of this family and everything. So the father said, "Go." And nothing more.
Yeah, Sue is talking about the culture where you just did not talk to your father that way. And that is really true. And I mean, I grew up in German culture, and again, the same thing. You did not talk to your father that way. I am astounded today at how lippy kids are. And the things they say to their parents are like, whoa, that would never have flown in my father's household or my grandparents. So that definitely was part of the issue too. He was so out of line, he was way beyond being insulting. And so again, the father did not have to put up with that. But I think there's another issue there also, and that is there are times where you can't tell people anything. I had an instructor who talked about a teachable moment. And that really stuck in my mind. You can't tell people anything unless their mind is open. Unless they are looking at you saying, you know, I'd really like to hear what you got to say. The son in the story was not in a teachable moment. He was totally focused on getting that money and getting out of Dodge and getting on with all of the good things that he thought were out there for him. So, you know, he was, you know, the father saying, I could not tell you a thing at this moment. I think in many addictive relationships, we're in that situation, aren't we? When they're drunk or when they're high, you can't tell them anything. When they are, you know, trying to come out of it, maybe that's not a great moment either. So then you're kind of saying, well, where is it? And I think from my own experience, it could be years. So sometimes you just say, I don't know if the day's ever coming, but I know today is not the day. And so you just have to let it go. Back to Yvonne.
And I realize this is a parable. I never understood why the father gave him the money. He could have just said, you're out of here.
Yeah,
So why would he give up his current assets
yeah,
to someone who was incorrigible at that point?
yeah,
I mean, that was a father's love,
yeah,
but maybe not so much.
yeah. So I don't know if everybody heard everything, but Yvonne was saying, why did he give him the money? He could have just said, go and have a good time and see how it goes. But he didn't have to give him the money. So that's a really good question. And it's one that I have asked myself also. So if you're thinking again about how the Father is God, God does that, doesn't he? He gives us his love. He gives us everything that comes out of that love. So he gives us this world full of resources and things. And so I think a lot of people would say, well, that was pretty dumb. You know how humans are. You know, they're going to waste it. Some humans, not me, of course. And, you know, so that's where we really get into the heart of God. God can't help being profligate. He can't help but give it away, because that is what love does. And so all these mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters who love their addicted family member, they can't help being profligate. They can't help love. And that's what makes you vulnerable. And did that hurt the Father? Oh my, it broke his heart. And now you understand the crucifixion. And you understand what Jesus did. It broke his heart. The earth was dark from noon till 3 because God's heart was broken. That is just unbelievable stuff. And yet, because he did that, when the son got down to the bottom and there was no lower place to go, who did he think of? He thought of his dad. I remember my dad. Now, I know I couldn't be the son again, but I could be one of the hired guys. At least I would have somewhere to sleep. I'd have something to eat. So he thought, okay, I'm going to go, knowing that I'm going to be in the bunkhouse, but hey, you know, at least I'll be close to my father. And when he's coming. The Father saw him. Another important part of that story. How did he know he was coming on that day?
Watching for him.
He was always watching. Again, think about that. I don't know how many years this son was gone, but every day the father went up in that upper room where he had a view of the horizon, and he looked on the road to see if anybody was coming. So he might have done that for a couple of years every day. And then, on that day, he saw him. Again, think about the depth of that kind of love. Who's got that kind of endurance? Who's got that kind of patience? But that is our Father. And so he runs to meet him. Now, he could have sat there and said, okay, when you get here, first thing I want is you're down on your knees and you're groveling at my feet and you give me that apology. Again, humanly speaking, isn't that kind of how the scenario goes? After all that you've done to me, I'm not going to make this easy for you. And instead he runs and embraces him and says, woo, you need a bath, and we're going to put a new robe on, and we're going to have a feast. Well, I mean, this son who thought he was going to end up in the bunkhouse, he can't believe it. Can you imagine what that did to his heart? Then you got the other son who's like, hey, wait a minute. I never got a feast like that. I never got that kind of a hug. And okay, now you got that other family dynamic. But that's another part of the addiction struggle, isn't it? Is that different parts of the family have different views on how this should be handled. And so then you get into the conflict with that. You know, you're being too soft, you're being too hard. You should do this, you should do that. And I think any parent tears their hair out because there is no happy solution. Even if the addicted person gets into recovery and they start to get their life back together, that doesn't mean everything is hunky-dory in this family. You know, you still got stuff to deal with.
In my career as a COTA, I worked at an inpatient alcohol and drug rehab center. And I can tell you that we could have someone do very well inpatient, and then we had to send them back to their families. And that was almost the worst thing we could do for some people, because their family culture, the relationships that they had, you know, those families, even if they had best intentions, knew what buttons to push and could send them into, again, a relapse. And it was very, very difficult, you know, to try to find a good place for this person who had made progress to go that wasn't toxic and gonna, you know, just lead them back.
Yeah. Yeah, so Sue was talking too about, again, being on the side of people who are involved in treatment programs and who are making some progress with the patient who's been there, and then they get back into the family, and then everything blows up, and everything goes south. Yeah, am I on? Yeah? Okay. Okay? All right, yeah, there I am. Yeah, so just a second. No, you know, that issue too, we always talk about the black sheep. So the addict is the black sheep. And that means that all the other sheep in the family are lily white. the reality is probably that there is all kinds of dysfunction going on in that family. So the black sheep is probably just an indication of other issues that also need to be addressed and perhaps never will be. So is there anything more complicated than family dynamics? And I think we can all go into our family trees, and there's just lots of things there that we don't know what to do with sometimes. So I always thought too, as a pastor, my family was supposed to be a model for everybody else. And so everybody wanted to see the pastor's family as perfect. And I think many fellow pastors like myself struggled with that of how can we be authentic, how can we be honest, and how can we be human like everybody else, so that people, again, can look at us and say, well, his family's got trouble too. And maybe that's a healthier thing, rather than you're living up to this expected ideal, but the reality may be quite different from that. So that has been my own personal struggle, I think, to just say, I made mistakes as a pastor and as a father and as a brother. And when people became aware of that, I think it was better than when we had that ideal of this person up on a pedestal. Because you can't talk to that, can you? You can't go to that person because they won't understand. They won't have any idea what you're talking about. So maybe the best thing the pastor can be is who he is, with his blemishes and with his faults, just like everybody else. Okay, anything else that has come to your mind on this, having an addict in the family?
So I read a book last year by a psychologist who was using addiction as a model for understanding homosexuality. Would you say that's a good idea, or?
So he used addiction as a model for understanding homosexuality. I'm not sure that those two, really belong together. I mean, there are so many addicts that aren't homosexual.
He wasn't saying that they were. He was saying that it functioned similarly.
Function similarly, okay. Well, I think in terms of family dynamics, there would be a lot of parallels. So families that have homosexuals do have a lot of conflict and a lot of struggle. So I think that would be the parallel probably on, how again do you work with that? Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to kind of share something about God's promises and hope. A number of years ago, our daughter, Molly, was really involved in drugs and in an abusive situation in that. And on Mother's Day, she was really upset with the whole family and didn't want to have anything to do with any of us. So on Mother's Day, she sent me a sympathy card that her mother had died. And I was really hurt by it. It just tore my heart apart. And God really, teaches us patience, and He does work things out. Because now, every day, when I talk to her or text her, she always says, "Mom, I love you." And it's just something that sometimes you have to go through that hurt, and you can't fix them when you want to fix them. But God, in His own time, will work it out.
Thank you so much, Naomi, for sharing that. Talking about her daughter, Molly. and where her mother or her daughter sent her this sympathy card saying, my mother is dead to me. And that is so hurtful. And you didn't stop loving her.
She never apologized, but yet, if God can forgive us for what I know I could forgive her.
Yeah.
And now we see her in a wonderful situation, and so God does work it out. Maybe not on our time, but
Yeah.
He does.
Yeah. So again, I think that gets us back to the Father in the prodigal son, that patience, the endurance, that just because he had been hurt and he had been rejected, he could not stop loving. And wow, there is the model that we try to attain to. There is nothing more difficult than to keep on doing that. And then hope we live long enough. And you did. And there are some parents that don't. But, you know, I experienced that same thing too. I didn't get the apology. And I realized it didn't matter. He was back. And that's what mattered. So again, I think that in our mind, as the Christian who is doing the loving, we have to be like our Savior in that we don't hang on to the hurts, that we let go of that. And that's not easy. You often wonder sometimes, why do people hang on to their wounds? What do you think? What makes them hang on to it?
They don't know how much better they would feel if they let go.
Yeah, they don't know how much better they'd feel if they let it go. That's true. And I think that's part of it. Mary.
I'm thinking of a certain case, I think it's not me, somebody else. A deep, deep hurt. Just can't get over it.
Yeah. And actually, I think too, the deep hurt, it becomes a part of you. It's like a scar. It's like a wound. You know, Jesus still had the wounds after the resurrection. So that is kind of interesting, isn't it? Because being glorified, you'd think that, well, God would have healed that up and it wouldn't show. But it was still there. The imprints in his hands and in his feet and in his side. And he said to Thomas, put your hand in there. So it does become part of us. I think for some people, they're almost afraid to let it go. Because I know who I am. I'm this wounded person. And so if you take that away, well, now I don't know. I kind of have to rework myself a little bit here. I'm a wounded person, but it's healed. So that's different, isn't it? So I think sometimes that is the issue too, that people are so used to who they have become that they're not sure they want to become someone new. So there again is that, you know, transformation, isn't it? As we go through these ups and downs and these terrible hurts and the healings, wow, that's an adventure. And sometimes you're hanging on to the handlebars and hoping you don't go flying off into space. It takes some getting used to. If we are ministering to a person who, again, can't let go of those hurts, sometimes maybe what you want to say to that person is, are you tired? Is that heavy? How many years have you been carrying that? What do you think it would feel like if you laid it down? If you gave it to God, what do you think would happen? So just try to get them to look at things from a little different angle. And maybe that gives them something to think about. But, don't just say to people, stop thinking like that. You have to change. You got to get rid of that. Be kind. Allow them to be, and then just say to them, but are you tired? I met a lady who was going to have open heart surgery, and she was really, really distraught. And so I was wondering, well, is it the surgery? And it kind of was, because this was her second open heart in about 10 years. And the first time her heart had stopped on the table, so she was like, this is the second time, I maybe won't make it. But what was really going on with her was when she was a teenager, her brother died from complications of a tonsillectomy, so totally unexpected. And at the funeral, these old ladies came up to her, and she was kind of wild at that point in time. She was hanging around with motorcycle guys. And they said to her, God is so hard to understand. He takes a beautiful person like your brother, and he leaves a devil like you behind. Wow, they wounded her. Oh, they wounded her. Now she's in her 60s, so we're talking 40-some years, and she's been carrying that wound. And she tells me that story, and I could see it was still bleeding. It was still fresh. And that's what I said to her. I said, you've been carrying this. Are you tired? Is it heavy? Do you want to give it to Jesus? Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. And that became a moment for her where she's like, yeah, I am tired. And she laid that down. So you just have to kind of see where people are at there. Anything else that you wanted to say about addiction? Was any of this helpful? Okay. But, addiction is a very widespread issue. I think the pandemic, in many cases, made it worse because people were so isolated and felt so much pressure that they turned to their drug of choice to try to help them to get through. So it's a tough world out there. Addiction still remains a huge issue in our society. My thoughts go with every one of you who has a family member or someone that you know who is caught up in that, and do what you can to be supportive and be there to encourage them. Well, we are at our time here, and boy, the time flies, doesn't it? Thank you so much for coming and for adding your thoughts to what we were doing here.